This is The Change Physician, episode 180. Welcome back to The Change Physician. I am Melissa Cady, the Challenge Doctor, with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro. And today we would love to talk to you about regret. We don't want to regret talking about it, but we want to talk about the power of regret. And no better person to talk about this because he knows more about the book that we're going to be referencing than Kevin Cuccaro. So take it away, Kevin.
Yeah, so this was a topic, and I've sort of led into it a couple of times. I think I've mentioned it on our Saturday salutations, which we do every Saturday when we stream off of Facebook at The Change Physician. And it's this book. This is Dan Pink's most recent one. Dan Pink is a journalist, and he's written quite a number of different books. The first one, I'm trying to think what his first one was that I remember was Drive on Motivation. And they took about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and then to sell as to sell as human, which I thought was a good kind of intro to sales, and kind of talked about the science of persuasion and actually what salesmen have been doing. And this one was really interesting, and I got it because I think I was one of the few minutes I was listening to a podcast. I don't have a lot of time to listen to podcasts right now, weirdly, that we're doing a podcast. But it has also been this topic of regret has been one that I've been thinking a lot of. It probably has to do with age. So I'm 48, going to be turning 49. We know that life satisfaction tends to drop in your quote unquote middle ages. I think it's the first third because I'm planning on living to 120. But you have a long enough time frame of action, and things have changed enough that you can start seeing and evaluating the past, and you've actually seen some long-term. You have 10 or 20 years of data now to kind of ascertain and this stuff. So I was fascinated by it, and the discussion that they had in this little podcast or whatever was fascinating. So I bought the book. And what is this about? Well, obviously about regret, right? And what's interesting is because there's this whole philosophy, he kind of jumps in one of the first chapters about how this idea that we should have no regrets. Don't live your life with regrets. Regrets are foolish. We have whole songs about it. Like if you ever listened to or saw the movie Inception, the themes, the music, which is a French singer, the song that they used to wake people up in those episodes, it's a French singer, but the title is basically I live no regrets. I live my life without regrets. Mm-hmm. And the first chapter then sort of brings up this is complete nonsense. This idea of no regrets is insane. It's simply not true. And realistically, if you didn't have any regrets, that means you didn't learn anything. And that's what I really, really like. So the whole book is basically, refuting this idea that living without regrets is the goal. The stent is actually to understand regret and how it works so that you can actually use it to improve. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that's awesome. And I won't say it was one of those books that were an absolute game changer to me. And that's probably because I have pretty high standards now. I do prefer books that are written by scientists who can actually express their writing really well because they can go in a little bit more depth. But there's a lot to think about in this one. And it dovetails really, really nicely into what we know and understand that's really coming out of social and cognitive and behavioral kind of psychology. Mm-hmm. So what do you want to know about regret? I guess it would be, do you have any specific questions for me? Because I also got my note cards because these are my notes that I take. I take notes when I read nonfiction and write out little summaries and things that I think are important.
Takeaways. So, I like it.
Yeah.
Well, it seems, I guess the question is how we define regret, because some people, I would think that the context of people saying, well, I don't want to have regret. I think there are people that know that they've made mistakes and they've learned from them. But I guess it's how we process those mistakes. Are we in a place where we're not demonstrating self-compassion and beating ourselves up over it, and the rest of our lives can't be normal because we can't let go of that lesson or this mistake or the loss? So I guess that would be my question. how is he referencing that regret?
That's a great question, because we should always start with the definition, And so what is regret? And a regret, if you kind of just look it up, it's a feeling of sadness, repentance, or disappointment over something that has happened or been done. It could also be something that has not happened or not been done. But the core of it is this disappointment, the something that didn't go the way that we wanted. What I like when he broke down regret is there's really, there's two key components to what constructs a regret. The first one is there's a comparison, right? We don't regret things that are. Regret exists when there's a potential of could be versus what is, right? So there's a comparison between two different outcomes, the current, and the other part about it is our imagined. Right? So because I did this other thing, this other potential result doesn't happen. So there's a comparison there. And then the second key portion of regret, which I actually really liked as well, is there's a perception of control over that previous decision. So we tend not to regret things that happened that we didn't have a choice in. They may be traumatic. We may have, maybe upsetting. They may have been a horrible experience, but it's very, very different because there's not that choice element in there. It was something that occurred, but the choice element makes it kind of that perceived choice that I had a control over this. So I kind of think about it like if you're in a car accident, right? Maybe you're in a horrible car accident. If you were drinking, the two comparisons and the regret associated with it. If I hadn't have been drinking and driving, then this accident wouldn't have occurred. And then this horrible outcome. So I'm going to regret this decision, rightly so in a lot of ways. But if you were in an accident out of the blue, you may or may not have a sense of regret around that. Because how that perception of control is, well, if I had chosen to take a different street, I never go this way, but I did this time, right? Realistically, there's a sense of random action account, but our brain's constructing meaning of it. But with that choice element, it really starts defining this idea of what regret. If I'd only had that change, if I hadn't changed my college major, I would have been whatever. If I hadn't gone into medicine, my life would have been better, right? So so this key component, which I really enjoyed, besides the comparison of the outcomes in this idea of control, is it involves a choice point.
Yes.
And then I've sort of even used the language in there. The other part about this is you also tend to see with regret is this idea if only, which sort of amplifies the feeling of regret. And the other thing is something occurs that sort of minimizes what he calls the at least statement. That's the silver lining statement. And these are two ways to actually, when you've come through a decision point, when you have an outcome that may be undesired to you, there's two ways that you can frame that actual decision point. If only I'd made a different decision, then this would have been better, or I would have been better. I'd have more money. I'd been happier life. Or I wouldn't have gotten whatever, right? I would have had kids, whatever it is. Or the at least would be, well, I know I didn't go to medical school, but at least I traveled around the world, something like that. And so that minimizes that. And then, but this sort of language does is even that. You may think, well, then you should never if only anything. Because if you're if onlying, you're actually amplifying this feeling of regret. Well, interestingly, if only is associated with behavior change. So this is one of those key foundations of regret. It's really important. It's like this. In this guy, I'm going to wrap it into negative emotions in general. There's this idea that negative emotions are something that you are not supposed to have or experience. We want to minimize all these negative emotions, and somehow you're only supposed to have positive emotions. Well, you cannot have positive without the negative because of the contrast there. And the purpose of negative emotions, including all these things that people think, anxiety is so awful and depression is so awful and regret is so awful. Yeah, they're unpleasant emotions, but they serve a purpose.
Yeah.
Depression, there's a point where it's involved with healing. Anxiety is the foundation for civilization. And regret is this feeling that is associated with learning and behavior change. Because we tend to regret the things that we did in the past becomes a learning moment so that we don't duplicate those motions into the future. And so I really kind of enjoyed kind of parsing that out. It kind of codified a lot of things that we've talked about in our podcast. And And then just sort of understanding all these little things. Because, the more you understand anything, whether it's a negative or positive emotion, the more there's a sense of perceived control around it. And the more that there is an acceptance. If you know that being anxious about something is a normal physiological response, psychophysiologic response, then we're less likely to diseaseify it. Now, there are times when you're in, if there's a difference between grief and major depression, right?
Yeah.
And in understanding where it serves a role. But the more you understand it, the more power you have, and the more that you have an awareness that you can do intentional change with it.
Yeah.
Other pieces of regret, what people, maybe kind of like what I call mechanisms, I think you may call them mechanisms or modes or whatever, is we typically have, when it comes to this choice, there's regressive action and inaction. You did something or you didn't do something. Which one do you think you are more likely to remember?
So regressive action versus inaction?
Inactions, things that you didn't do, regrets of things that you didn't do or opportunities that you didn't pursue.
Right.
Or regrets of action, things that you did.
Oh, regret. I think you said regressive action.
No, no, regrets of.
Sound like it.
Yeah, I slurred my words sometimes.
Is it the inaction?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that one was a big one for me because I've been there's I think it was a Butthole Surfer song or something. It was like there was like an intro in the music that this is like a punk group from the 80s, and it was like, remember, son, you always regret the things that you didn't do more than the things that you did do. And so I always kind of think about that quite a bit. And actually that tends to have some science behind it, that regrets of inaction, thinks, oh, if I'd only done this, oh, if I'd only went to Europe after I graduated from high school, if I only had dated whoever or married this person. This idea of inaction versus action dominates when they did the survey. I forgot about that. They actually did this huge study of like thousands and thousands of people to kind of pull out this regret data by 3 to 1. Now, there's a couple ways you can take that, though. You can either say, well, people actually regret inaction more than inactions. And so you need to just do things. Like if you have a choice point and okay, I'm going to do these things then because I don't want to regret it later on, or at least that's what the learning I'm pulling away from this. I think, though, he didn't talk about this. I think it actually has to do more about the brain, though, because the difference between a regret of inaction and a regret of action is with the inaction, there's an unknown and there's an uncertainty, and our brains hate uncertainty, or I shouldn't say uncertainty. What they do is they focus on uncertainty. So my suspicion is if someone was really parsing through this and started doing some really big studies, what they would find is that we just recall them more and we fill them in with imagination, which Dan Gilbert, another psychologist with another great book I've talked about before, Stumbling on Happiness, would call the filling in trick, how your imagination will then populate this whole thing. And then all of a sudden we can say, oh, if only, if I hadn't done this, or if I had only done that one thing, then I'd be living in a golden castle somewhere. Because we have uncertainty, we have absolutely no data, and so the brain just goes crazy. And so those actions versus inactions, we tend to regret them more.
Yeah. It was interesting because when you think about things you have done or hadn't done and how they really impact you, you always wonder, you might have cognitive thoughts about it, but you also wonder from the subconscious in the background how that's impacting you. I mean, not that you can like parse that, apart, but it's interesting how those things might influence us without us realizing it's influencing us. That seems perplexing.
So everything influences us.
Yeah. Well, it's like everything we talk about with pain, everything's always influencing. There might be a dominance of something, but there's always influence from everywhere. But then I thought about the shame associated with some of these things. Like, not just like, if only, at least, like, how does shame tie into all? Did he mention anything about shame at all?
Well, not in the whole thing, like Brene Brown and the whole shame part. I would also, though, argue that there is there's a point for shame.
Yeah.
You know, that's a negative emotion.
Yeah.
And the goal is not to wallow, though. And that's the kind of the point with even this regret. You can shame, if you put it as a subset of regret or an aspect of regret, where actually let me go to the definition of it so I don't totally blow what because I have a definition I would use. I don't want to use it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, because they're hand in hand, right? So this definition for the noun of shame is a painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by the consciousness of wrong or foolish behavior. So you see those same things. There's a choice point of a behavior that we actually did, and then there's a feeling of humiliation or distress associated with it. And from a shame standpoint, I mean, there's importance to societal function. If you have absolutely no shame, then people are just running down the street and doing whatever the hell they want, right? But I do think from a regret standpoint, there's a difference of continuing. If you live in the regret, actually, what did I say on this? I just wrote a little note to myself. Is it's kind of with the regret and understanding this choice kind of architecture that's associated with it. And he did give a little a couple of ways of looking at how you can use regret in a constructive manner. But one of them, which was actually in step 2, so let me just say regret repair, right? And so when it comes to repair of regrets, if you have something that you're sort of dwelling on, the ways that you can sort of overcome it and use it constructively outside of decision making. The first one is actually the step 1 he was talking about is self-disclosure. So you have to actually, if you have a regret, one of the best things that you can do is actually name and tell the regret. And you don't have to do it to other people, although that's helpful in some situations. But what you're trying to do is basically reveal it. You're pulling it out so you can fully see it. You're opening that door, you're looking at it, you're turning the lights on. And then you can, what he calls relive and relieve it. So you're sort of opening up it again to the full experience. I pulled this back to Pennebaker's work on expressive writing.
I was about to say,
yeah. So because there's a lot of interview in there, and he was talking a little bit about Pennebaker, and he was actually talking about more in the self-compassion. I think her name is Kristen Neff, who's a psychologist in that part where it comes to self-compassion. Huh?
Yeah. She's in Austin as well.
She's in Texas. So when this first step of actually acknowledging what the regret is, you're informing this dialogue and you're providing an explanation. And what this allows the brain to do is sort of organize and integrate our thoughts. Right? This is actually some of the data when it comes to expressive writing. Is people say, well, is it the venting part? And there's like these 3 theories about it's the venting and the expression. But really what that seemed to point at is the more that you are writing, and there's a sort of think feel writing that's associated with, in specifically when it comes to expressive writing in general, is what you're allowing to do is process feelings into a coherent narrative. So particularly around trauma, which is a little bit deeper than the regret itself, it's that processing and creating a coherent narrative out of the chaos that seems to be beneficial. So when it comes to regret, if you kind of think about it as sort of a lighter sort of mini micro trauma, it's the same thing. It allows us to convert these abstract feelings of upset, sad, sorry, vagaries of what this future can be. It allows us to process this into a more coherent story that we can then use to drive further action from it. It's sort of like very long, you talk about what's the purpose of feeling. Emotions really is what they're kind of referring to. If you're feeling happy, glad, sad, or mad, what's the purpose of that? And some people think that's just the emotion. Other people think it's something that you're supposed to repress, particularly negative emotions. But there's a lot of data that seems to the reason that we are feeling organisms and we're not Vulcans out there is because what feeling allows us to do is like a motivation for action. And that feeling should be then filtered through your thinking into a pursuit of an action. So writing things down in this self-disclosure and kind of reliving and relieving it allows us to create this narrative that you take all this feeling of regret and then use it for fuel in order to coherently think about it. So there's an awareness there that you can now intentionally change. or intentionally learn or intentionally choose to do something. So that was step kind of one.
Thanks for joining us on part 1 of The Power of Regret, and we will continue on part 2 in the following episode, and see you there.